The Princess and the Vampire King by Eileen Sheehan. Notice: portions of this story may prove too graphic, sexually explicit, or violent for sensitive readers. This novel is intended for adult readers. Chapter 1. The harsh shrill of the quarter-hour whistle brought me back to reality like a crisp slap across my face. I was still in that horrid room with those horrid creatures awaiting a fate too horrid to imagine. Horrid, was that the best I could do? This place was beyond horrid. It was so bad there was no description for how bad it was. My mind was fuzzy. I needed to focus. Those creatures, what were they? They went beyond horrid to look at, horrid to be around, horrid to interact with. My brain would not function properly. I could come up with no word to equal what they were. I gave up. Horrid would have to suffice. I smiled to myself. What did it matter what word I used to describe what was happening? Was it really that important? In the not-too-distant future I would become a nothing, a thing of the past. What I thought and the words I enunciated with would mean less than they already did. You smile, human. Do you take pleasure in this? Said a deep surly voice. My head shot up and I looked directly into the beady, yellow eyes of my scaly captor. Does it matter? I slurred boldly. Not in the least, the lizard beast muttered as it moved away to inspect a woman to my left. I thought not, I mumbled as my chin fell back to my chest. Silence, a deep masculine voice from the back of the room roared. I will have silence. I could have been defiant and said something else just to irritate them. After all, I was a dead woman soon enough. What could they possibly do to me for breaking their precious code of silence that they weren't already going to do anyway? But I didn't. My brain thought it, but my tongue stayed immobile. Also, something deep inside my feeble brain shouted for me to shut up and behave myself, and I just might get out of this thing alive. Imagine that? I knew it was a fairy tale wish, but I obeyed the command and kept quiet anyway. Maybe somewhere in the recesses of my mind I was holding out for a miracle. My long, bony arms had been trussed over my head for so long I could barely feel them. The numbness was traveling down my back and into my equally bony legs. I looked around at my fellow captives. They made sense. Each one had enough meat on their bodies to feed these lizard beasts in fine fashion. If they dined on soup, then perhaps I could understand their reason for including me in the mix, but from what I'd been able to decipher they only ate meat, and they ate it fresh and uncooked. My scrawny 5'3" physique barely hit the 100-pound mark on a scale while soaking wet. I didn't belong here. But then, did any of us? Another quarter-hour whistle pierced the air. I felt the conveyor belt jolt as it slowly moved me to the left toward the dreaded room. How many were ahead of me? The great hall was long and filled with bodies. Where did they all come from? My eyes were blurred from whatever they'd injected into my neck a few whistles ago. It was a calming agent of some sort. Apparently the lizard beasts preferred their food, not fight back. It was working. I reckoned that by the time I reached the end of the line I would be a drooling fool without a care in the world. Do with me what you will, creep. I could give a damn. Rough, scaly, and incredibly powerful hands started poking and pawing at my naked body. I was disgusted by the vile assault, but couldn't even manage a flinch. Yep, the injection was definitely working. What is this doing here? Is this a prank? The owner of the assaulting hands demanded with disgust. Womanin, I just asked you a question and I expect an answer. Why is this scrawny female here? She was here when I came on duty, boss, replied a very worried lizard-like guard that I assumed was womanin. It never occurred to you to question her presence, growled the one he called boss. No boss, I did not think, womanin began. That's right, you did not think. Boss interjected. Had you used that tiny worthless brain of yours, you would have realized this female is far too inferior to be presented at our table. In fact, she is an insult to even the lowest Dragos table. My body swayed in response to his shove of disgust. Get her out of here, he ordered. Yes, boss, Womanin replied with a mixture of fear and respect in his voice. Womanin pulled my drugged body from the hook holding the rope that trussed my wrists together and flung me over his broad, reptilian shoulder as if I was nothing more than a sack of flour. My arms flapped against his thick, scaly back with each step that he took, but he seemed not to notice. I fought back the vomit as my face slammed into his abrasive leathery flesh. Not only was the sensation atrocious, but the stench was overwhelming. I had heard about the Dragos off and on while growing up, but always in a fairy tale. I recalled the stories stated they did not have an elimination system like humans. They eliminated waste through their skin. I now knew this to be true. My conveyor stunk in the worst way. He reeked of dirt, something that resembled sweaty urine, and blood. Having been raised near a farm in upstate New York, I can tell you that I've been in pig pens that smelled better. He took me to their garbage dump outside the eatery. I'm pretty sure I felt a rib or two snap when he dumped me unceremoniously onto a raunchy pile of human discard. As I lay amongst bones picked clean of flesh and smelling like blood mixed with vulgar creature saliva, my body purged whatever contents my stomach contained. When it was empty, I continued to heave. It was as if my on-off switch was broken. By the time the wrenching subsided, I was overwhelmed by the accentuated pain in my ribs. The powerful contracting of my diaphragm as I purged and purged and purged intensified the damage from being tossed onto the pile of bones. I had no doubt at least one rib was broken, possibly two. As much as I wanted to be free of the pile of human remains, the injection was taking hold full force. I was disoriented with virtually no motivation to move. I could feel the hollow darkness off in a distance calling, waiting to consume me. It was only a matter of time now. Although the substance they injected wasn't lethal, I got the sense I would be out long enough to be buried alive when the next load of remains was dumped on top of me. With my slight frame, my weakened condition, and a broken ribcage, it was a pretty sure bet I would be trapped beneath the rubble. Instead of meeting my death as food for the Dragos, I was going to meet my death from those who had been their food. How droll. I decided I'd rather not be aware of my ultimate demise. I closed my eyes and willed the darkness to overtake me. I was warm, cozy, in fact. I kept my eyes closed while I tested my limbs. They were functioning. I felt my rib cage. It was bandaged. Puzzled, I slowly raised my lids to view my surroundings. I found myself in what looked like a cave that was furnished with fairly lavish tapestry of red, green, and gold woven together to create what looked like a coat of arms. The flying dove with an olive branch led me to believe the owner was of a peace-loving clan. Thick, lush carpeting from the Orient was spread over the hard-packed dirt floor. Strategically positioned on top of it were an ornate table and two chairs, one comfy-looking overstuffed chair, and the bed I occupied. Was I dreaming? Had I died? I'd heard when you die you select the era and time you'd like to play out eternity in. From what I could see, I'd gone back in time, but I had no clue how far back. I inhaled deeply. The rich aroma of a thick stew made its way into my nostrils and my stomach reacted with a vengeance. I'd purged its contents in that pile of human remains and it demanded solace. Even the visual remembrance of that horrific place did not deter it from demanding its rightful due. I looked around the room. Was I alone? Were angels going to come in to serve me? Spirits maybe? I gasped in trepidation. I was in heaven, wasn't I? My mind raced through my actions prior to my capture. I could think of nothing I had done that would have warranted my going to hell. Surely this was heaven. It just had to be. The faint rustling outside the cave caught my attention. Since I was uncertain about everything right then, I decided it best to play possum. I had just enough time to close my eyelids far enough to appear asleep, while leaving them cracked open just enough to view the activity in the room from beneath my abnormally long, thick lashes before he entered. I had all I could do not to gasp with admiration. That settled it. I was in heaven and some sort of god just entered the cave. His 6-foot-tall, muscular physique moved with the power, grace, and presence of someone possessing an undeniable abundance of self-confidence. His feet practically glided when he walked. His lean, well-formed muscles rippled with each movement as he fed newly chopped wood to the embers of what had once been a roaring fire. Thick, dark hair framed his pale, aristocratic features as he fanned the fire until flames once again danced to his satisfaction. His perfectly formed mouth made me aware of my own thin, overly broad lips. I'd wager his mouth didn't consume his face when he smiled like mine did. His only apparel was a pair of black leather pants that fit like a second skin. The rest of him, including his feet, was bare. I could have admired him all day. I'd never encountered so perfect a man. But then, he wasn't a man. He was a god, and I was in heaven. I found heaven very different than what I'd expected it to be. There were no angels playing harps and singing as they floated by on clouds. I struggled to remember my early religious education. If memory served me correctly, heaven consisted of various levels. Perhaps I'd entered one that didn't have angels in it. After all, they worked closely with the Creator God. My deeds may not have been bad enough to force me into hell, but they were also surely not perfect enough to get me seated next to the Creator of all. That was it. I was in one of the lower levels of heaven. It made sense. Didn't I learn that in the lower spiritual realms they ate and drank and felt just like humans? Well, if that was the case, it was perfectly fine with me. That stew that my handsome god was stirring smelled delicious and my mouth was watering for a taste of it. "You're awake," he said with his back still turned to me. I cleared my throat and whispered, "Yes." "Don't be concerned, your faculties will all return in no time," he assured me as he bent down to fill a bowl with the delicious-smelling fare. His emerald green eyes touched mine and he flashed the most dazzling smile my way. I was probably hallucinating, but I would have sworn his teeth sparkled like the actors in a gum commercial I'd seen on television. I squeezed my eyes shut briefly and gave him a renewed appraisal. Nope, I wasn't hallucinating. His strong, well-defined teeth were a brilliant white and glistening to the point they almost hurt my eyes. Had his flesh been darker, it would have made a hideous sight. As it so happened, his pale complexion blended naturally with his brilliant teeth, creating an alluring, almost irresistible effect. "Are you a god?" I asked meekly. His chuckle echoed through the cave as he said, "Hardly. It's a nice thought though. I am in heaven, right?" I urged. "Heaven," he said with a puzzled look. "You believe this to be heaven?" He stood up and carried the much-anticipated steaming bowl to me. I extended both hands to receive it and almost dropped it. A bit of hot broth spilled onto my leg. It was then that I realized I was still naked. He watched me with interest as I struggled to maintain control of the precious bowl of stew while pulling a quilt that had been barely covering me over my nakedness as best I could. "I've already seen everything you have to offer. I see no reason risking a serious burn for non-essential modesty. Please," he gestured toward the stew, "enjoy and relax. If it makes you feel better, I promise I won't look." With that, he left the cave. Are you coming back?" I called after him with a scratchy voice that could barely be defined as audible. I cleared my throat multiple times in hopes of lubricating my vocal cords into working condition. Of course, came his faint reply from the distance. I noted how far away he'd gotten in a very short period of time. He'd moved abnormally fast. With the stew commanding my attention, I gave my strange rescuer minimal thought as I dove into the most delicious fare I could recall ever eating. My stomach churned and hurt as I stuffed it, but I kept going. When my bowl was empty, I looked around to be sure I was alone before I slowly made my way to the boiling pot for a refill. I would probably regret it in the long run, but I didn't care. The food was delicious and I had no idea when I'd be able to eat again. It was better to stuff my gut as full as I could and hope I was able to keep it all down. I'd completed my second bowl when he returned wearing a smirk that made me want to slap him and kiss him at the same time. His emerald green eyes twinkled with what I took to be amusement as he stared at my empty bowl, but he said nothing as he extended his hand to take it from me. As he moved to put the bowl on the nearby table, I noticed he carried a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He returned to my side and handed it to me. I pulled the ties slowly while I puzzled over what he could be giving me. It was a soft bundle. Could I be so bold as to hope it be clothes? The thought hastened my speed of opening the wrap. An enormous smile consumed my face as I looked down at. Neatly folded, one on top of the other, black leather leggings, a tan woolen tunic and a beaded belt. I smiled my thanks and donned the tunic without hesitation. It reached my mid-thigh, which afforded me enough modesty to stand and step into the leggings. Everything fit as if it was specially made for me. Thanks, I mumbled, they fit perfectly. I should hope so, he said, with no further explanation. Where am I? I asked, deciding I didn't want to know how he managed to present me with leather pants that fit like they were made for me. You're safe, he mumbled as he started back out of the cave. Safe, where? I urged. Here, he tossed over his shoulder before disappearing. I waited for what felt like hours for his return, but to no avail. I had no idea who he was, but he was my only contact at the moment, and from what I could tell he was also my savior. I didn't want him to leave me. I didn't want to be left alone. I felt tired and abandoned. I longed to leave the cave and look for civilization. At this point I'd settle for anyone to keep me company. I would have at least explored outside my cozy sanctuary, had I trusted my ribs not to shift and puncture a lung. Somewhere over time, I managed to relax enough to drift off into sleep. The warmth of the fire and a satisfied belly promoted one of the deepest rests I'd had in ages. Chapter 2. When I finally roused enough to force myself free from the sweetest slumber I can recall in my 24 years of life, it took a bit of struggling to remember where I was. I sat up on the bed and swung my feet over its edge. They barely touched the floor. I didn't recall being so small in it before, but then, I'd been pretty messed up with drugs and injuries. Injuries. I remembered my ribs and felt for the bandage beneath my tunic. It was gone. I pulled the tunic up to inspect more closely. Searching the cave interior with my eyes, I was disappointed to find no mirror. I checked myself out as best I could without it. There was no sign of any damage that I could see, nor was there any pain. How had I managed to heal so quickly? It had been quickly, hadn't it? I couldn't tell, since I'd lost all concept of time. I made note that my rescue was the second miracle to happen since I'd been captured by those grotesque creatures, the first being my rejection in the food line. I said a small silent prayer of thanks. I was pretty sure I'd already done so, but I wanted to thank my godlike savior again with a clear head. I sensed his presence and that he'd been coming and going, but I saw no signs of him at the moment. I hopped off the bed with more vitality than I'd felt in a long time. What was in that wonderfully delicious stew? I wondered as I padded over to the fire. It was still going strong with signs of recently being tended. I looked around. I was alone. Feeling energized and curious, I decided to brave the outer limits of the cave. I needed to know where I was so I could make plans on getting home. I really hoped those beasts hadn't teleported me to some obscure location, or worse, planet. Although I knew it could be done, I had no experience with teleporting. It would be difficult for me to get back on my own. Would my altruist be willing to continue his aid and help me get back? Did he even have the ability? The air felt crisp and cool against my exposed flesh as I stepped out into the moonlight. I estimated it was after midnight. I listened for sounds of life around me, but all was quiet. It looked like the whole world was sleeping. All except me, that is. I noted the fullness of the brilliant moon. This meant that I'd been in the cave healing and sleeping heavily for about 2 weeks. I really owed my benefactor a debt of gratitude. The cave was on the edge of a forest. Tall pines mingled with gnarly oaks and maples. It was a perfectly normal-looking forest that gave me no hint at all as to where I was or what era I was in. An owl screeched its presence and startled a small squeal out of me. "Be careful. We don't want to give away our hiding place," said a rich, sultry voice through the night. I jumped to look behind me to find my handsome savior with a load of firewood balanced in his arms as if it weighed no more than a sack of feathers. "Where are we?" I asked. "Safe for now," he replied as he turned to enter the cave, "unless you keep that howling up." It was a little squeal, I muttered as I followed him back inside. "Haven't you ever heard the saying, 'The forest has eyes'?" he chided. "Is that the same as 'the hills have eyes'?" I said sarcastically. I was referring to the movie, of course. It was a way of testing things. If I'd gone back in time, he wouldn't have a clue what I was speaking about. "I saw that film," he said as he dropped the wood next to the fire. I didn't much care for it. Okay, so I was still in my own era. That was excellent, but I still had questions such as what was a Dragos? I remembered that word from my nightmare as if it had been branded on my brain. "Can I know your name?" I said with more self-confidence than I really possessed. I felt it best to be polite rather than burst into a line of questions about my whereabouts and the creatures that abducted me and then left me for dead. "Jack," he said, matter-of-factly. "Nice to meet you, Jack," I said as sweetly as I could. "Is it?" He chuckled with a tone that could only be described as sarcastic and walked back out of the cave. I was really growing tired of the way he just up and left as the mood struck him. "Wait," I commanded with more intensity than I'd intended. It left me a little shaken. I did my best to hide it from him. He stopped in his tracks, but didn't turn around. I watched his shoulders tense and then loosen again. It was as if he was struggling with what to do while he remained with his back to me. "Please don't go yet," I said in a gentler tone that I was only able to accomplish after some serious breathing exercises. I'm very confused and lonely and, well, I'm a little frightened." "I was captured by the Dragos," he interjected. "I pulled you from their refuse pile." The tone of his voice left me uncomfortable. I'd angered him. I wasn't sure what I should say. "I'm sorry for barking at you and thank you for all you've done" was the most obvious, yet it didn't seem appropriate for the mood, so I said, "I owe you my life," instead. "You think so?" he almost growled. Although I was taken aback by his aggressive tone, I refused to be deterred. I was determined to smooth things over. I needed to show him my gratitude, for my sake, if not for his. There was no doubt in my mind that I would have died had he not pulled me from that abhorrent pile of human remains. "Yes," I said steadily. "Be careful." "I just might take it," he half-whispered before bounding out of the entrance. Suddenly my legs refused to hold me. I collapsed in a heap. The thick carpet acted as a barrier between me and the cold earthen ground. I could smell the earth in its fibers, yet it looked fairly new and fresh. I would have pondered on how long the cave served as Jack's plush sanctuary had I not been overwhelmed with his parting comment. Did I hear him correctly? Did he threaten to take my life? Had he saved me from certain death at the hands of the Dragos only to kill me himself? If I hadn't heard his words with my own ears, I would never have entertained such a thought. He seemed like a perfectly normal man. True, he was a little uncommunicative, but, considering where he'd found me, I assumed he'd seen some trauma of his own. Maybe he also narrowly escaped being food for those beasts. Or, horror of horrors, he was a cannibal and scavenged the remains off the bones of the refuse. I shook my head. Now I was being ridiculous. If he was a cannibal, he'd have surely eaten me over the course of the last few weeks, not feed me. I forced myself to giggle. It was amazing how the mind could dream up such ridiculous stuff and make it seem real in a flash. I took a closer look around the interior of the cave that was now my sanctuary. This was clearly someone's home or at the very least place of refuge. If Jack hadn't set it up, I was sure he'd used this place for his own. Yet he'd barely spent any time there since I'd arrived. Did he have another dwelling nearby? That didn't seem logical, but then, nothing about what had happened so far seemed logical. Dragos weren't real. They were creatures from fairy tales told around campfires for the purpose of scaring your fellow campers. Since when did creatures in fairy tales come to life? Several days passed with no words spoken between Jack and me. When I saw or sensed him coming, I feigned sleep in order to avoid speaking with him. I needed time to process the fear his comment instilled in me. It had to be the better part of a week gone by before I started to get restless. I'd completely lost track of time. I had no idea how long I'd actually been in that cave. When did I arrive? I estimated I'd been there a total of 3 weeks, but was I correct? I kept falling in and out of sleep, staying awake only long enough to fill my stomach with the ever-present stew that I never grew tired of and couldn't seem to get enough of, and then right back into slumberland I went. "You've been here for 6 weeks, not 3, said a feminine voice from a distance. Startled, I jumped and quickly looked around, but saw no one. "Over here, dearie," the voice cooed. I couldn't decide if it was a friendly coo or not. "You're rather rude, aren't you?" I stated bluntly. "You're an expert on rudeness," the owner of the voice said, clearly annoyed. "It doesn't take an expert to recognize rude," I replied bravely. It didn't matter that this was my first and only visitor other than Jack. Sneaking into the cave and remaining in the shadows was rude, and I intended to make that clear. "You're an ungrateful bitch, aren't you?" the voice said. To whom am I being ungrateful, and for what? I thanked my rescuer. I see no need to be polite to someone who sneaks in here, reads my mind, and then speaks from the dark recesses of the cave instead of showing himself, I spat. "Herself, you twit," the voice spat back. "You sound like a man," I lied. I'd actually meant to say her, but, in my nervousness, I got confused. "You look like you just escaped Auschwitz," the voice blurted out. I had no response for that because I was sure it was true. I stood in stunned silence for a while and then burst out laughing. I mean, seriously, I was arguing with a bodiless voice. "Touché," I breathed between peals of laughter, "you've got me there." Before my startled eyes, a glowing translucent ball emerged out of the shadows and slowly grew to enormous size. The larger it got, the opaquer it became. When it reached a size large enough to accommodate a body, a tall, slender, but shapely brunette stepped out and stood not 5 feet away from me. I stood mesmerized by the overlarge almond-shaped eyes that were perfectly positioned on her small, creamy bronze, oval-shaped face. Her pixie-type nose looked at home between her smooth, arched brows and full, ruby lips. Had it not been for the pointed ears on the sides of her head, I would have labeled her perfect. I'm not perfect either, she chuckled good-naturedly while pulling on her ears and lifting her chiffon gown to display grotesque and hairy feet. It's an odd combination, I mused as I slowly admired her slender curves and perfect complexion. Not where I come from, she smiled, seemingly unaffected by my comment that most would consider rude. I'm from New York. The state, not the city. That's on Earth, I replied without thinking. Between the lizard beasts and this odd-looking person, I'd come to the conclusion that I'd left Earth for some other planet, but I was surprised to hear myself say it aloud. Me too, she chimed. Earth, that is. How can that be? I asked with genuine surprise. Now that's typical, she snorted as she walked to the large, comfortable-looking chair by the fire. You humans are all the same. I'm sorry, I said and then chastised myself silently. What in heaven's name was I apologizing for? It's just that I've never seen anyone from Earth that looked like you, so I don't understand how you can claim your look is not an odd combination. You can't help it, I suppose, she sighed. It's just that I hoped you would be different. I mean, it's not like Jack to take in just any stray human. A sparkle of amusement tinted her large eyes as she continued, it's especially not like him to let them live. You must be too skinny for him too. He eats people? I gasped as my hand flew to my throat. My fears were being confirmed. Ha ha ha, you're so funny, she chortled, but offered nothing else. My visitor seemed to know her way around the cave quite well. She produced some herbal tea and 2 cups from a cupboard I hadn't even thought to investigate. We spent the next few hours sipping tea and getting to know each other. She told me her name was Loanna, a name quite common to her kind. She equated it to Jane or and in my language. When I asked her what her kind was, she said, Earthling, as if I'd insulted her. I let the topic go for a while and just enjoyed her bubbly conversation. It had been what seemed like an eternity since I'd had the luxury of enjoying light-hearted conversation over a cup of herbal tea. I wasn't in a hurry to give it up. At some point over the course of our discussions, Loanna grew more comfortable with me. I discovered that my new female friend was well over a century old. She took great pains to explain to me that she belonged to a race called Squatula. Although they lived upon the planet Earth, they lived in an alternate dimension than that of humans. I learned that, like the Dragos, Squatula had a life expectancy of approximately 200 years. This meant she was what we would consider middle-aged. I compared her youthful, light-hearted actions and appearance to that of a middle-aged human and smiled. No wonder we were considered an inferior species. Loanna enlightened me on the variances of Squatula around the planet. Apparently they differed in race just like humans differed. Some were of highly superior intelligence and skills while others bordered on primitive. She confided that, over the centuries, there were times when they interbred with other species, including the humans, which added to the variances in race. Her race was a product of such interbreeding. Loanna was not only light-hearted, intelligent, and beautiful. She was also highly skilled in the art of teleporting from one dimension to another. She often made trips from inner Earth to outer Earth, which was how she met Jack. I learned she was a missionary of sorts. Like humans, Squatula were prey for the Dragos and, therefore, like humans, they wanted them eliminated from their planet. Loanna traveled between planets, by way of teleportation, to assist in the task of weakening the Dragos until the time came that they could be fully driven out. This was a dangerous mission that only a few were allowed to participate in. Although she made light of it, I knew she was more than she was letting on to be. I mentioned to Loanna the fact that, for centuries, there were sightings on Earth of a large, man-like, ape-like beast in various locations of Earth. Some called the beast Bigfoot. Some called him the abominable snowman. Some called him Sasquatch. All were basically names for the same type of being. She nodded, smiled, and proceeded to tell me that they were of the Squatula breed, but significantly removed from her clan. She equated it to the Chinese of the human race versus the humans from the continent of Africa. They were human, but significantly different in size, shape, coloring, and features. One thing that was similar was their ability to move from one dimension of the Earth's etheric layer to the other. I learned that Earth was made up of 4 vibrational dimensions that housed physical inhabitants. For the most part, the planet looked and behaved the same in each one. They even housed similar, if not identical, plant and animal life. The truest difference was the variance of species of intelligent beings in each level. The dimensions eventually melded into one within the core of the planet where the vibrations were denser. It was in this area that the Dragos who teleported to Earth from other planets dwelled. Their location allowed them to travel into any outer level with ease to capture and accumulate the life they depended upon for sustenance. They were an evil, lizard-type humanoid that migrated from another part of the galaxy some millennia past when their own planet got so overpopulated that food became a scarcity. Earth and Kurr weren't the only planets they dispersed their pioneers to, but they proved to be one of the more desirable for the Dragos to inhabit. I'd had the misfortune of being abducted while walking down a remote section of road in the wee hours of the morning. It turned out that road was one of their favorite locations for acquiring food since it was fairly isolated and easy to remain undetected. I heard discussions during the early hours of my capture that the mountains of Arizona and the Arkansas hot springs were other prime locations. Loanna gave me a detailed list of Earth's hot spots for abduction. I burned it into my memory bank and vowed to heed it when and if I ever got back home. I questioned her method of dealing with the Dragos. Did she fight them head-on, or was it a sneak attack? To my disappointment, she refused to discuss the topic. I'd gotten all I was going to get about the Dragos out of her for the moment. Chapter 3. Will you listen to the demands she makes? Does she know who you are and just doesn't care? Loanna said. Her cackling filled the cave. Quiet. Jack snapped. I spun at Loanna. I know he's a vampire, I said. I saw with my own eyes. That doesn't frighten you, she asked. Of course it frightens me, I replied. I've been nothing but frightened by one thing or another since those vile, scaly creatures abducted me, but I still need know. I deserve to know what's happening. She's got courage, Jack, I'll give her that. Who is she? Loanna purred. I told you, he replied. You told her wrong, I stated firmly. Jack turned to Loanna and ordered, Get out. I'm crushed, she pouted. Get out or die, he said firmly. With a few hisses for emphasis, Loanna made her departure. I couldn't help the sadness that swept over me. In the short time I'd spent with her, I'd enjoyed her company and considered her a newfound friend. I'd been lonely for companionship. Meeting her only accentuated the fact. Discovering her to be a wolf in sheep's clothing was practically devastating. Try not to let it bother you. I've yet to meet anyone who hasn't been fooled by that one. Even me, Jack said in an attempt at comforting. There was no sense in denying my feelings. It was obvious he had somehow tapped into my emotions. As I forced myself to release the tension that consumed me, my legs were suddenly unable to hold me. When I reached for him to support myself, he swept me into his incredibly strong arms and carried me to the bed. He smelled of musk and spices, clove and cinnamon amongst them. The aroma caused a heady sensation that I found overwhelmingly intoxicating and pleasurable. Are all vampires as alluring as you? I stuttered. His erotic chuckle would have been enough to tell me all I needed to know, but he took it one step further. Before I knew what was happening, his lips were on mine. At first the kiss was soft, slow, and sweet. It was me that changed the course to something more torrid and frantic. I have no idea what got into me. All I knew was that I wanted to consume him. I wanted to climb inside and become a part of him. I'd kissed only one man in a way that could be deemed passionate, my fiancé Mark. We'd kissed often, but in no way was I prepared for a kiss of this caliber. The overwhelming ecstasy threatened to consume me. I wanted more. I had to have more. I grabbed at the belt of my tunic and tossed it away. His firm hand slid beneath it to cup my barely formed breast. My body jolted as his thumb teased my nipple. A groan purged from deep within my throat. It sounded foreign, yet I knew it was me making it. I needed him inside me with an urgency I'd never experienced before. Under normal circumstances, I would have been incredibly self-conscious about the fact that my body was mostly skin and bones with breasts that barely distinguished me as a woman, but somehow it just didn't matter. The only other man I displayed such confidence with was Mark. We'd fooled around, but we hadn't gone all the way. We decided to save the actual act of consummation for our honeymoon. It seemed so romantic to wait. Now, all thoughts of Mark, our engagement, and my virginity disappeared as I focused on one thing and one thing only. I wanted Jack to take me completely. I wanted it in a way I'd never be able to describe. Enough, he said as he pulled away and reached for my belt. I sat in breathless and amazed disappointment as I watched his strong thighs carry him to the opposite side of the cave. His tight buttocks strained against his leather pants as he bent to tend the fire. I don't understand, I managed. Do you know who you are? He asked. Of course I do, I replied. I'm Jessica Tay. Who you really are. Do you know who you really are? He persisted. I'm really Jessica Tay, I said firmly. He said nothing. After a lengthy and uncomfortable silence, I added, I'm not a vampire. No, he nodded, that is something you are not. I shivered with a mixture of discomfort and pleasure as his eyes bore into my very core. I shook my head to clear it. Guilt replaced pleasure as Mark's image emerged in my mind. What was wrong with me? I'd behaved like a wanton woman with this stranger who obviously didn't want me. No, not just a stranger, a vampire who could kill me at any moment. My mind searched my memory bank for all I'd seen in movies, read in books, and listened in conversation about vampires. Had he put me under his spell or something? If I recalled correctly, they were able to hypnotize their victims with their eyes. Is that what happened? No, it couldn't have been. If he'd hypnotized me to act the slut, then he wouldn't have stopped me like he had. How embarrassing. I was mortified. I could look at him no longer. I could be near him no longer. I wanted to find a hole to crawl into or a corner to hide in or something. Damn him for putting me in a round cave with no place to hide, and double damn him for standing in front of the only exit. My mind raced. What had Loanna used to disguise her whereabouts? I could see nothing that would work. Then I remembered she'd appeared from a globe of light. She hadn't hidden behind a thing. Damn. It was frustrating to be a mere human amongst mythical and magical beings. The time will come when you will know who you truly are. When that time comes, we will see if we should continue this, and more, he said as he started out the entrance. I am your guardian. Get used to it, he tossed over his shoulder without looking back. I threw myself face down on the mattress and pounded it until I'd released enough humiliated frustration to allow my body to relax and sleep. It wasn't long before the dreaming began. I was wearing my dream wedding dress. It was cream-colored, full-skirted chiffon with silk-capped shoulders, and the most intricate beading on the bodice one could ever imagine. James looked incredibly handsome and distinguished in a dark tuxedo and silver silk tie as he walked me proudly toward Mark, who stood waiting in the same dark tuxedo and silver tie. Mark looked sexy, calm, and poised like a model from a GQ magazine. My heart swelled with love, pride, and joy at the sight of the two men that meant the most in the world to me looking so handsome and happy. Unaccustomed to the 3-inch stilettos I'd foolishly strapped onto my sneaker-favoring feet, I stumbled. James was quick to catch me and set me aright. I'd waited so long for this moment I could hardly believe it was finally happening. It would have been perfect except for one thing, my parents. I'd have given anything in the world to have them be there with me on this, the most wonderful day of my life. Tears welled up as James finally deposited me next to Mark and the preacher began the ceremony. My mascara mixed with my eyes' salty fluid and I could hardly see a thing. I relied on my ears to keep me abreast of the ceremony's progress. Mark said his vows and the preacher turned to me. It was my turn to vow to be his and his alone till death do us part. Just as I said I'd do, my eyes cleared up enough for me to see the man standing, preparing to seal our vows with a kiss. Mark was gone. Jack's hot lips consumed mine in a kiss that tingled down to my very toes. I sat up with a start. What a nightmare. Moisture beaded my brow and trickled down the back of my neck. I was sweating, yet chilled to the bone. I spoke into the emptiness of the cave, assuring myself that I was engaged to Mark and I would find a way to get home to him so that we could marry. Hearing the words aloud brought a sense of comfort and I pulled the thick quilt up to my chin and closed my eyes. Willing myself back to sleep, I prayed for it to be a dreamless one. It seemed like only a matter of minutes before I was sitting up in bed feeling rested and refreshed. Jack was tending the fire and stirring the pot of stew that I just couldn't seem to get enough of. After eating the same thing for so long, it was a wonder I could even look at it, let alone salivate for it like I was. I wasn't going to tell you I was your guardian, Jack said without turning around. I'm not who you think I am, I mumbled, whoever that might be. Jack stood up and stretched his back in a cat-like manner. Once again, I wondered where he stayed since I'd taken over his cave. Is your back bothering you? I asked softly. It's tight, that's all, he replied, matter-of-factly. I have your bed, don't I? I asked meekly. That you do, he said with a smile. Vampires sleep and get sore backs, I mused aloud. I need to read some of the books you've read, he chuckled. Do you own a shirt? I teased. Jack caressed his chest as he asked in a mocking tone, you don't like? My heart skipped a beat as he flashed his brilliant white and perfectly straight teeth in a genuine smile. Damn, he was handsome, and then some. Too many more smiles like that and being faithful to Mark would prove completely impossible. I suddenly remembered my behavior the night before and blushed. I cleared my throat for lack of something to say to ease my humiliation. Jack seemed not to notice my condition as he continued to stir the stew. It smells pretty tasty. I'd say it's ready. Are you hungry? He cooed. I'm starving, I blurted as I rushed to join him near the fire. I reached for my bowl from the rough-hewn board that was mounted into the stone wall with spikes and acted as the kitchen self. As I extended my hand toward the pot of stew, my arm brushed against his. The hairs on my flesh stood to attention, as if electrified. I'd never experienced something of this nature before. It both thrilled and confused me. I jumped back involuntarily. I won't hurt you, he assured me. You confuse me, I stammered. Why did you save me? Why haven't you killed me? Don't believe everything you read and hear about vampires. We're not killers run rampant. Killing isn't my nature, he said curtly. After a short silence he continued, I told you why you're here. His eyes locked mine as if to emphasize his last statement. I felt my body being pulled to him like a nail to a magnet. What was it about him that I found so difficult to resist? I'm engaged to be married, I stammered. "Congratulations," he replied gently. He cupped my chin momentarily before dropping his hand and heading out of the cave. "We're leaving this place tomorrow. Rest up while you can," he tossed over his shoulder before disappearing. I spent the remainder of the day resting and going over in my head how I came to be captured by the Dragos in the first place. It didn't make sense. There was nothing on the news or in the gossip chain to indicate that they were raiding in my area. If there had been, then precautions would have been taken like they had 22 years earlier when people were disappearing without a trace. That was also when my parents died in a car crash. I was very young at the time and couldn't remember it, but people told me a curfew was enforced for quite some time. We were only allowed out of our homes between the hours of 11 o'clock in the morning and 4 o'clock in the afternoon. During this time, the streets were packed with military enforcing martial law and protecting our parameters. It prevented people from traveling to my parents' funeral. In fact, more than once over the years I'd questioned if we'd even had a funeral for them because, as hard as I tried, I couldn't remember one. I relied on my memory for so much with them because there were no pictures of them to keep their image alive. Other than my vague memories, the only evidence that my parents existed was a grave site for me to adorn with flowers. I'd been to see a movie with Mark and then gone out for a few drinks afterward. He'd driven. He'd also had, in my opinion, too many drinks to be considered sober enough to drive home. Of course he disagreed. When I refused to get in the car with him as the driver, he hopped behind the wheel and sped off, leaving me to find my own way home. Since I didn't live more than a few miles from the bar, I just started walking. There was a stretch of road that was fairly rural and lonely, especially at 1 o'clock in the morning. To add to the ambience, the moon was barely visible and a fog had settled. It was while navigating this stretch of road and contemplating on how surprisingly thick the fog was that I felt myself being grabbed, dragged, and then trussed up like some wild beast. I was tossed into some type of craft that silently hovered a few feet above ground and landed on top of a mound of other unfortunates who were trussed just as I was. I remember being barely able to breathe as they continued to stack us like a pile of pancakes, with little to no regard for our well-being. When it seemed like the craft was too full to continue to hover above ground as it was, several lizard men hopped in and the door closed. The stench was almost unbearable. It would have been bad enough to have to endure the stench of the Dragos in those tight quarters, but there was also the odor of feces and urine from frightened humans as well as perspiration and halitosis to deal with. I don't know when it all became so intense that my body shut down, but it did. When I awoke, I was naked and trussed upside down on some conveyor system awaiting my turn to become their dinner. I'd always been self-conscious about my scrawny body. This was the first time I was grateful for it. I'd never longed for voluptuous curves again. When night came around, I was surprised at how quickly and deeply I fell into sleep. I'd gotten used to the little cave with its minimal comforts. Even the bed seemed to have conformed to my body, as if claiming it. I wondered where we were going. Jack said we were leaving. Leaving where? He'd yet to tell me where we were and I had no clue. I originally thought it was somewhere in the wilderness not far from my upstate New York home, maybe Canada but then Loanna popped up with this story about Kurr and I was totally mixed up. I made it a point to push my humiliation aside and question Jack, who arrived fully dressed in shirt, breeches, and shoes about where we were and where we were going as soon as he entered the cave the following morning. He took my abrupt questioning in stride and was more than willing to oblige me with answers. To my shock and dismay, we were not in the wilderness of New York State. Nor were we anywhere near Canada. Loanna had spoken truth. I'd been teleported to a distant planet called Kurr by lizard humanoids called Dragos, who found humans to be their favorite cuisine. I would have denied the truth of it, had I not remembered that the reason I lived was because I was unsuitable as food for any Dragos table. My heart sank. I questioned him on where he planned on taking me and was relieved when he quite willingly informed me it was his intention to return me to Earth. He enlightened me on the ways of time bending, something I had very little knowledge of. According to Jack, Mark wasn't even aware I'd been taken because in Earth time only a matter of minutes had transpired. I couldn't imagine how weeks on Kurr would only equal up to minutes on Earth, but who was I to question it? Instead, I nodded my acceptance of the fact and allowed him to continue speaking. I've kept my distance from you for a reason, and it's not what you think, Jack said as he moved around the cave collecting a few things and placing them in a sack he'd slung over his shoulder. I'm a vampire, true, but I drink the blood of animals, not humans. You've never drank human blood? I asked with surprise. I didn't say that. I said I drink animal blood. I'm not a killer of animals either. I take only what I need to get by on, nothing more. If the animal is large enough, what I take has no more effect on him than a human donating blood to a blood bank. As for humans, there has been an occasion or two where I've been placed in a position that required I partake in their blood, but they have been far and few between. In truth, I dislike not only the taste of human blood, but the notion of it. Okay, now I'm confused, I interjected. Why would a vampire be repelled by human blood? I thought you were meant to drink it. A lot of people think that, but it's not true. We aren't naturally meant to drink human blood. We have human DNA in us, after all. It's an act that's far too close to cannibalism. It's only the perverted or the desperate who do it. Wow, that's a new twist on vampirism I never expected, I said. Isn't it? He said as he smiled that alluring smile. I guess the truth isn't nearly as big a sell for the movies, novels, and scary campfire stories. I guess not, I replied. I watched Jack continue to select items to place in his sack and then asked, "Were you born a vampire?" No. Vampire babies exist, but it's rare to be born vampire. The majority are made, he replied. It's an affliction that consumes you after are bitten by another vampire. We look at vampirism as a type of disease. I had no idea, I muttered. Very few do, Jack replied. I was bitten when I was very young. So you continued to grow then. You didn't just stay the same age as you were when you became a vampire, I stated excitedly. Do you mean like Kirsten Dunst in Interview with a Vampire? He chuckled. I'm afraid not. I've been growing and aging right along. Though, I'll admit the aging process is incredibly slow and my strength is triple that of a human. He shrugged, so there are some perks to vampirism. How old are you? I blurted out. How old are you? He chortled. I'm 24, I replied without hesitation. I know, he said soberly. You don't remember me, do you? I looked at him, puzzled. It felt right and natural to be in his company, but I attributed that to the fact that we'd been together for almost 2 months. We've met before? I asked hesitantly. You sat on my knee when you were just a babe. I was visiting your home. It was just before your parents died, he said sadly. You knew my parents? I said hopefully. How? How did you know them? Were you a vampire when you knew them? He stopped collecting items and stood looking at me. His handsome face looked so sad. I wanted to stroke it and tell him all would be well. When he walked over and sat next to me on the bed, I couldn't resist placing my palm on his strong cheek. Again, I marveled at how warm to the touch he was. Again, I remembered the stories of vampires being ice cold. He pulled my hand from his cheek and held it in his own as he drew a deep breath. What I'm about to tell you might be difficult for you to believe or even understand, but it is true. One thing I want to assure you is that you will always be told truth by me, no matter whether you want to hear it or not. I nodded but said nothing. Since that night I'd argued with Mark and done something as innocent as walk home. Rather than put my life in the hands of a drunk, I'd discovered there were aliens that looked like lizards teleporting people to an alien planet as food, vampires that were repelled by human blood, and creatures that shapeshifted from humanoid to reptilian. It all seemed surreal. What was one more bit of information to add to the fairy tale mix? After a moment's hesitation he continued, "The people you knew as your parents were wonderful people. They were loving and kind and generous almost to a fault. I knew your mother, Sarah, all of my life. We were siblings. But, you're a vampire." I squealed. "As was she," he replied. A loud gasp escaped my lips. I opted to bypass the comment that my mother was a vampire as I stammered, "You're my uncle?" "But, you know." He raised his hand to stop me from saying anything more. "Wait," he said patiently. "Let me finish before you say anything else, please." "Can you do that?" I nodded and fidgeted to put a little more distance between him and me on the mattress. I was mortified at what occurred between us the night before. It was no wonder he stopped. The fact that I was still aroused by his presence filled me with shame. "I'm not your uncle," he continued. My head shot up and I was immediately on the alert. If he was my mother's brother, then why wasn't he my uncle? I may have been confused, but I was also overwhelmed with relief. I hadn't almost committed incest after all. "I'm not your uncle because Sarah isn't your real mother," he explained. "Remember, I told you it is rare for a vampire to have a child and, if it did happen, the child would be vampire. You are not a vampire." He'd spoken quickly, as if anticipating the reaction that came next. "What the hell? Are you on crack?" I demanded. Of course she was my mother. I looked just like her. Everyone says so. You had her coloring and you were young, he replied. He shifted his body to face me more squarely and took my face between his hands. I had no choice but to look at him. His eyes were filled with a mixture of concern, sadness, sympathy and something else, passion. Please listen to me very carefully. How you grasp and accept what I'm about to tell you will make all the difference on whether we make it back to Earth safely, or even at all, he said with quiet firmness. I could feel his body relax as my expression changed from one of rebellious disbelief to that of an interested and eager listener. If what he had to say meant I could be home again, then I was all for whatever it was, even if it meant him telling me I was some alien creature. I was born in the year 1203. I was the youngest son in a family of 6 children. My parents weren't wealthy by any means, but we managed to enjoy life and live in comfort. I was 10 years old when my parents took all of us on a hunting trip along the Canadian border. It was off-season, but even if it wasn't, it was such a wild and barren place I could imagine we'd be hard-pressed to stumble into another hunter unless we'd searched for him. We were the only humans for miles around that fateful weekend. My parents fashioned a hut out of greenery, branches, and some burlap we'd brought with us. The hut looked out onto an enormous lake. My father took my 2 eldest brothers, Walter and Samuel, downstream for late-night fishing. I have no idea what they were trying to catch. I was too young to know the difference and, quite frankly, it doesn't really matter. What does matter is that because they were a distance from our hut, they were spared the horror of what happened in their absence. A small group of vampires stumbled upon us while out hunting for food. They weren't the good kind of vampires. They'd been tainted by evil. We call them black vampires. They killed everyone but Sarah and me. I loved to swim and explore underwater. I'd trained myself to hold my breath for an incredibly long duration of time so I wouldn't have to surface often. I used this skill to still my body and convince them I'd died. It's how I survived the attack. By holding your breath, I said in wonder. By holding my breath, he confirmed. Wow, I said with admiration, and Mom, heir Sarah? How did she survive? She didn't actually. She died, but I'll get to that in a minute, he continued. When my father returned, he took my two brothers and set off to hunt down our murderers and kill them. I suspect by the wounds on our necks he knew they were vampires, but I couldn't be sure since our paths have never crossed since then. I assume the vampires killed them. I lay amongst my dead family for quite some time wondering why my father wouldn't have cared for our bodies before leaving for his vampire hunt. Of course, now that I'm older, I understand the urgency in catching up with them was too great to take the time, but back then I didn't understand. I decided to bury them myself. When I got to Sarah, I could see that she was still alive, although barely. The vampire virus had already taken hold of my body and I instinctively knew what to do to preserve her. I sliced my wrist and forced her to take some of my blood and then I snapped her neck. You killed her? I gasped. I guess you'd say that. You see, if you are so near death like Sarah was, the only way to prevent it would be to die with the infection in your body and some blood still intact. My killer was sloppy and somehow managed to get cut or something and his blood got into my wound. That was not the case for Sarah. She had simply been fed upon. At the rate the blood was seeping from her wounds, she was going to be dead in minutes with no chance of living, even if it was as a vampire. I made the choice to preserve her and I have never regretted it, nor does she. We waited a week for my father to return before going to our Aunt Alice, my mother's sister, for help. Alice was a kindly soul, much like my mother, and took us in. I don't know exactly how she explained the deaths and disappearance of my family, but she somehow managed. Her home was in an isolated part of the state of Maine similar to the way your aunt's farm is isolated, but even more so, and she was a bit of a nature child. Her knowledge of herbs and their uses for remedies and spells far surpassed that of the average person. She also had knowledge of the occult, which included vampirism. It was with Aunt Alice's assistance that we learned to deal with the vampire affliction and not let it interfere too heavily with our lives. We kept it a secret, of course, which wasn't all that easy. On more than one occasion someone was able to see the differences in us, but when they discovered who our aunt was, they attributed it to her weird and witchy ways. Being able to go to her for assistance was a true stroke of luck. Yes, but it still doesn't explain why you say I'm not who I think I am, I said impatiently. He looked at me with surprise and said, I see I've rambled, my apologies. No, it's not that at all. I mean, I want to know more about you and heir Sarah. I do. Your story is fascinating. It's just. I guess I'm just a little impatient to find out, I stammered. Why I say you're not my niece, he interjected. Well, yes. I said. I'm getting to that, he said, before filling his lungs with air. When my sister met the man you knew as your father, it was love at first sight for both of them. He tried to fight his feelings for her and she him. She was a vampire, after all. As hard as they tried, they could not escape the love they had for each other. When she broke down and confided her secret to him, he decided to take a chance and entrust her with his most precious secret. He was not of Earth. He was from the planet Kurr, this very planet that we now hide in a cave on. Are you saying I'm part alien? I wailed. No, I'm saying that you're entirely alien. You were born here on Kurr. More than that, you are of royal blood. The man you knew as your father was actually a captain of your true parents' guard. He was sent to Earth with you in tow. You were nothing more than a babe in arms. You lived quietly for some time, but eventually your whereabouts was discovered by a band of soldiers sent to search for you. When it was clear he would be unable to protect you, he asked me to take over. Not long after I accepted the responsibility of your welfare, he was killed in a heated battle. He died, but not before he wiped out the band of soldiers and you were once again safe. What, I'm like some princess or something? I practically screeched. This was way too far-fetched to even remotely be taken seriously. You are indeed like some princess. You are next in line for the throne of Kurr, which is why your safety is so vital. This is ridiculous, I said as I stood up. I needed to get some air and clear my head. Things were getting far too weird. He grabbed my wrist. I'm not finished. Sit down, he said in a tone that was far more authoritative than he'd displayed since our conversation began. It was clear I was wearing on his nerves. Well, good. His wild stories were wearing on mine, so good. Maybe he'd think twice before spinning such wild fantasies again. Just like time is different on Earth than in Kurr, so is the growth process. Yours was stunted by Earth's atmosphere. You're 24, but you have the body of a 14-year-old. At my burst of outrage and indignation over his comment, he waved his hand and continued, if you stay on Kurr much longer, your body will catch up with your age. We can't have that happen if we want to return you to Earth as if nothing happened. It'd be rather difficult to explain, don't you think? Mark would accept me no matter how I looked, I said boldly. What about the rest of society? He asked. I shrugged. I've been monitoring you from afar since you were a young babe, he said. It's true, you were a task at first, but after watching you grow and become the lovely creature you are today, you ceased to be a task and became a pleasure. Caring for you brings sheer joy into my life. I don't understand how you cared for me. I never saw you. Never, I said. The woman you call Aunt Jenny at one time was Sarah's best friend. When Sarah was no longer able to care for you, Jenny gladly took over the responsibility of raising you, but always with me in the background watching over. She knows who you are and what you must eventually do. She knows and understands. When we get back to Earth, we'll pay her a visit and she can tell you for herself, he said calmly. Panic welled up inside me. Could Jack's story be true? Was I really an alien princess? I decided to change the subject. Tell me about what happened to you when you became a vampire, I said. I took on some of the genetic traits of the vampire that created me. I absorbed DNA from him, he said matter-of-factly. I looked at him closely. He really did look human. Had I not seen his fangs for myself, I would have never guessed him to be a vampire. It was confusing, especially since he was also coming and going in broad daylight and was warm and supple. Nothing added up to the monsters of lore. Something deep inside me told me Jack was telling the truth about everything, including me being an alien. It would take some time to absorb. For some crazy reason, my thoughts traveled from me being an alien to me kissing Jack. Maybe it was because we were in such close proximity of each other. I remembered our kiss. It still had me reeling. How could that be when I loved and was to marry another man? Actually, Mark never really said he loved me and I'd never said I loved him. It was just understood that we loved each other. When we decided to get married, it was during a conversation about how bonded we were as buddies and it just made sense to tie the knot. After all, if friendship is at the base of a relationship, it stands a much better chance of lasting. We'd heard it on a television show. Maybe Dr. Phil, but I couldn't be sure. Before I knew what was happening, I was wrapped in his strong arms with his lips consuming my own. How did that happen? Had I initiated it or had he? I felt like I was dreaming and would wake up any time now. It was a wild tale that was definitely more suitable for a dream than for real life. In some ways, I much preferred it. I soon stopped worrying about who initiated what and fell into his kiss with passion that equaled his own. There was something about him that brought out a side of me that was foreign, yet exciting. When we finally found the wherewithal to separate, I sat breathlessly still and waited to wake up. After a few seconds, it was clear that this was really happening. It was also clear that he was just as affected by our kiss as I was. The silence between us was unsettling. Neither knew what to say. I finally popped out with, "You're wearing a shirt." This has been the first 3 chapters of The Princess and the Vampire King by Eileen Sheehan. Read by Uriah. Copyright Eileen Sheehan.